I learned something strange after living in New York for 26 years. The nights that change your life never look important when they begin. That Thursday started like every other Thursday. I spent the day helping children find books they were too young to appreciate and answering questions from people who thought librarians knew everything. By the time the city library closed, my feet hurt, my stomach was empty, and all I wanted was to get home to my tiny apartment in Queens. Rain had started sometime after sunset. Not the gentle kind. The cold, steady kind that turned sidewalks into mirrors and convinced most people to stay indoors. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and hurried toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. The digital schedule flashed red when I arrived. Route delayed. 20 minutes. I sighed and checked my phone. 4% battery. Perfect. A gust of wind pushed rain across the street. The few people waiting beside me looked just as miserable as I felt. One by one they disappeared. Some called rides. Others gave up and walked away. Within 15 minutes, I was standing alone beneath the flickering shelter light. The city suddenly felt much bigger than usual. I opened a rideshare app. No drivers available. I tried again. Same result. A construction project had closed several nearby streets, and the storm was making traffic worse. My phone dropped to 3%. Then 2. I laughed softly to myself. Of course. The rain intensified. Water streamed along the curb. Most storefronts had already gone dark. The neighborhood looked abandoned. That was when I noticed something odd. A yellow taxi turned slowly around the corner and stopped directly in front of me. I blinked. The illuminated sign on the roof reflected off the wet pavement. For a moment I thought I was imagining it. I had not seen a single taxi in that area all evening. The passenger window lowered halfway. The driver looked at me through the rain. "Need a ride?" he asked. His voice was calm, deep, not impatient like most drivers working late-night shifts. I hesitated. Something about him did not fit. Maybe it was the suit jacket visible beneath his dark coat. Maybe it was the expensive watch on his wrist. Or maybe it was the fact that he looked more like someone leaving a board meeting than someone driving a cab. "You are a lifesaver," I admitted. A faint smile appeared. "I hear that occasionally." I climbed into the back seat. The interior smelled clean. Not like coffee or fast food or air freshener. Just clean. The doors locked automatically with a quiet click. For some reason, that sound made me glance toward the front mirror. The driver's eyes met mine briefly. Green. Sharp. Observant. Then he looked back at the road. "Queens?" he asked. I nodded. "How did you know?" Another small smile. "Lucky guess." The taxi pulled away from the curb. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. For several blocks neither of us spoke. Usually silence with strangers felt awkward. This felt different. Comfortable. Almost intentional. I watched city lights blur past the glass. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten slightly. The streets around us were nearly empty. No taxis. No ridesares. Nothing. Just us moving through the storm. And for the first time that night, a question entered my mind. If there were no taxis operating in that neighborhood during the storm, what exactly was he doing there waiting for me? I spent the next few minutes trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. New York was full of strange people. Maybe he was simply a driver working an unusual shift. Maybe the storm had made me overthink everything. Yet the more I watched him through the rearview mirror, the less convinced I became. Most drivers filled silence with conversation. They asked where you worked, complained about traffic, talked about sports. This man did none of those things. He drove with calm precision, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, his attention fixed on the road ahead. The city lights slid across his face every few seconds, revealing sharp features and an expression that never seemed rushed. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. "How long have you been driving a taxi?" I asked. His eyes flickered briefly toward the mirror. "Not very long." That answer somehow created more questions than it solved. "You do not sound very enthusiastic about it." A small smile appeared. "It has its moments." I laughed softly. That is not exactly a glowing review. Most jobs are less glamorous than people imagine. There was something unexpectedly funny about the way he said it. Dry. Understated. Like someone who rarely bothered explaining himself. The rain continued falling outside, turning the city into a blur of reflections and color. For the first time all evening, I felt myself relax. "Well, my job is exactly as glamorous as people imagine," I said. "Children return books with sticky fingerprints. Adults forget where they parked. And someone always asks if the library sells coffee. Do you enjoy it?" The question surprised me. Most people never ask that. They asked what I did, not whether I enjoyed it. I thought about my answer for a moment. "Most days." He nodded as if that response made perfect sense. "Most days is better than never." Silence returned, but this time it felt lighter, easier. A few minutes later, my phone finally died. The screen went black in my hand. "Great," I muttered. "Problem?" he asked. "My battery just gave up on life." Without a word, he reached into the center console and held out a charging cable. I stared at it. "You happen to carry the exact charger I need? Preparation is useful." His answer sounded suspiciously practiced. I plugged in my phone and shook my head. "You seem prepared for everything." "Not everything." Something about the way he said it made me glance toward the mirror again. For the briefest moment, his expression looked distant, almost sad. Then it vanished. We stopped at a red light near Midtown. A black SUV pulled alongside us. I barely noticed it until the driver inside turned his head. The man looked directly at our taxi. The instant he recognized my driver, his posture changed. His eyes widened slightly. Then he lowered his gaze and faced forward again. The reaction lasted less than 2 seconds. But I saw it. My driver saw it too. Neither of us mentioned it. The light turned green. We continued moving. Several blocks later, another expensive vehicle appeared behind us. Then another. Not close enough to seem threatening. Just close enough to notice. I looked out the rear window, confused. "Do you know those people?" I asked. His hands remained steady on the wheel. "No." The answer came too quickly. Much too quickly. For the first time that night, I had the unmistakable feeling that the man driving this taxi was hiding something. And somehow, I suspected that whatever he was hiding was much bigger than I could possibly imagine. I thought I would never see him again after that night. New York was too big for coincidences and too busy for fairy tales. People crossed paths every day and forgot each other before reaching the next block. That was what I told myself anyway. 3 days later, I was standing outside the library after another late shift when a familiar yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. My breath caught before I could stop it. The passenger window lowered halfway. "Working late again?" he asked. I stared at him through the evening drizzle. "You cannot be serious." A faint smile appeared. "I will take that as yes." For reasons I could not explain, I laughed. The sound surprised both of us. A few minutes later, I was sitting in the back seat again, watching city lights slide across rain-speckled glass. This time the silence felt different. Less like two strangers sharing a ride and more like two people continuing a conversation neither had finished. "Do you always appear when my day goes badly?" I asked. "Only when traffic allows it." I shook my head. That is not an answer. It was not meant to be. Over the next few weeks, something strange happened. I kept running into him. Sometimes outside the library. Sometimes near my apartment. Once outside a grocery store when I was carrying far too many bags and pretending they were not heavy. Every appearance seemed accidental. Every appearance felt impossible. The city had more than 8 million people. Yet somehow Adrian always appeared at exactly the right moment. I never asked for his number. He never asked for mine. Still, our conversations grew longer. He learned that I loved old bookstores and rainy afternoons. I learned that he drank black coffee, rarely slept enough, and had an irritating habit of answering questions with half answers. One evening he picked me up after work and found me staring at a stack of overdue notices. "Bad day?" he asked. I sighed. A man returned a history book 37 months late and demanded a refund on a fine he never paid. Adrian considered this seriously. A dangerous criminal. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. For a moment I caught him smiling too. Not the polite smile he usually wore. A real one. Changed his entire face. Another week passed. Then another. Somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of him as my driver. He became the person I looked forward to seeing at the end of difficult days. The person who listened without judging. The person who somehow understood when I was tired, frustrated, or worried before I said a word. Yet there were still things about him that made no sense. He never seemed concerned about money. His clothes were always expensive. His watch probably cost more than my annual rent. And every so often I would notice people staring at him. Not with recognition exactly. More like respect. Or caution. One Friday evening I climbed into the taxi and found him unusually quiet. His attention seemed distant. Focused on something beyond the windshield. "Everything okay?" I asked. Adrian glanced toward the mirror. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like someone carrying the weight of a small country." For a second, his expression softened. Then he looked away. Some responsibilities are difficult to leave behind. Before I could ask what that meant, the taxi stopped at a red light. Across the street, 3 men in tailored suits stepped out of a black luxury sedan. The moment they saw Adrian, they froze. One of them lowered his head respectfully. Another immediately opened a phone and started typing. Adrian noticed my expression and drove forward the instant the light changed. Neither of us spoke for the next several blocks. But for the first time since meeting him, I realized I was no longer wondering whether he was hiding something. I was wondering how big that secret really was. The first real crack in Adrian's carefully constructed mystery appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. It happened so quickly that I almost missed it. The library was unusually quiet. A storm threatened outside, turning the sky gray and heavy, and most people had chosen to stay home. I was reorganizing a display of historical biographies when my phone vibrated. A message from Adrian. "Running late. Coffee shop on Lexington. 20 minutes." For reasons I refused to examine too closely, that message immediately improved my mood. 25 minutes later, I stepped into the small coffee shop and spotted him sitting near the window. He looked exactly as he always did. Calm. Composed. Impossibly out of place in a room filled with students and office workers. A cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. "You are late," I said as I sat down. "I know. That is all the explanation I get? For now." I rolled my eyes. "One day I am going to get a real answer out of you. I admire your optimism." I laughed despite myself. The conversation drifted toward books, then movies, then childhood memories. It was easy. Effortless. The kind of conversation that made hours disappear without warning. Then the door opened. 3 men entered. Expensive suits. Polished shoes. Serious expressions. They looked completely out of place among the students typing on laptops. The moment they noticed Adrian, everything changed. All 3 men stopped walking. One immediately straightened his posture. Another lowered his gaze. The oldest of the 3 gave a small respectful nod. Not the kind people gave acquaintances. The kind people gave someone important. Very important. Adrian's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. "Gentlemen," he said calmly. The 3 men approached our table. "Sir," one of them replied. "Sir." My attention immediately sharpened. The man standing closest to Adrian leaned down slightly and spoke in a lower voice. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. "Meeting. Tonight. Important people waiting." Adrian listened without interrupting. Then he answered quietly. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. The men nodded and left as quickly as they had arrived. Silence settled over the table. I stared at Adrian. Adrian stared at his coffee. "Sir," I finally asked. "That seems formal for a taxi driver." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Perhaps they are very polite. And perhaps I am secretly the mayor." That earned a brief laugh, but not an answer. Before I could continue, the television mounted above the counter switched to a local news segment. Nobody paid much attention at first. Then a photograph appeared on the screen. The room around me seemed to disappear. I knew that face. Dark hair. Sharp green eyes. Calm expression. Adrian. The caption beneath the image read, "One of New York's most influential business leaders expected at tonight's charity gala." My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned toward the man sitting across from me. Adrian did not look surprised. He did not look embarrassed. He simply looked resigned, like someone who knew this moment would eventually arrive. That is you. He exhaled slowly. Yes. I looked back at the screen, then back at him, then back at the screen again. Nothing made sense anymore. The taxi, the expensive suits, the black SUVs, the men calling him sir, the effortless confidence, the expensive watch. Suddenly every strange detail from the past few weeks aligned into a single terrifying realization. Adrian was not who I thought he was, not even close. And judging by the look in his eyes, the truth was far bigger than anything I had imagined. I did not remember leaving the coffee shop. One moment I was staring at the television screen. The next, I was walking through Manhattan with cold air hitting my face and 1,000 unanswered questions racing through my mind. Adrian had offered to explain. I had refused, at least at first. The problem was that every explanation I invented sounded less believable than the truth. By the time I reached my apartment, curiosity had replaced most of my anger. I opened my laptop and searched his name. Hundreds of results appeared instantly. Business articles, charity events, real estate projects, financial magazines, photographs of Adrian standing beside politicians, executives, and public figures I recognized immediately. The man I thought drove a taxi was apparently one of the most influential people in New York. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. You have got to be kidding me. The next morning my phone buzzed shortly after 9. A single message appeared. I am sorry. I should have told you sooner. Adrian. I stared at the words for almost a minute. Then another message arrived. Coffee. No secrets this time. Your choice. Despite everything, I smiled. The confidence annoyed me. The honesty surprised me. 3 hours later, I found myself sitting across from him in a quiet cafe near Bryant Park. Sunlight streamed through the windows. People passed outside carrying shopping bags and umbrellas. The ordinary scene felt strangely disconnected from the conversation waiting to happen. Adrian arrived exactly on time. As always, he sat down and studied me carefully. You look angry. That is because I am. He nodded. Fair. I folded my arms. You let me think you were a taxi driver. You assumed I was a taxi driver. Because you were driving a taxi. A faint smile appeared. That is technically true. I pointed at him. That is not a defense. To my frustration, he laughed quietly. The tension eased slightly. Not much. Just enough. Why? I finally asked. Why were you driving that night? For the first time, his expression became serious. Completely serious. Because sometimes it is the only place people tell the truth. I blinked. What? Adrian leaned back. When people think you are unimportant, they stop performing. They stop pretending. They become themselves. His gaze settled on the table briefly. Most of my life is spent around people who want something from me. Money, influence, access, favors. He looked up. You were the first person in a very long time who wanted none of those things. The answer caught me off guard. I had expected something dramatic, something mysterious. Instead, it sounded lonely. So you just drive around the city meeting strangers? Not usually. Then why me? Silence settled between us. Adrian rarely looked uncertain. Now he did. I do not know, he admitted. You got into the car and started talking about books. Then you complained about overdue library fines for 10 straight minutes. I laughed despite myself. That was a serious issue. I am aware. His smile returned briefly. Then it faded. The truth is, Madison, I enjoyed being around someone who treated me normally. The honesty in his voice made it difficult to stay angry. Unfortunately, it also made everything more complicated. Because as I sat there listening to him, I realized something uncomfortable. The secret that bothered me most was no longer who Adrian really was. It was the fact that I had started caring before I knew the truth. And I was no longer sure what to do with that feeling. I spent the next several days trying to return to normal life. It did not work. I shelved books, helped visitors find research materials, smiled at coworkers. Yet every ordinary moment seemed slightly off, as if someone had quietly adjusted the world while I was not looking. The biggest problem was Adrian himself. Now that I knew who he really was, I started noticing things I had ignored before. The expensive suits. The constant phone calls he never answered in front of me. The way restaurant managers greeted him before he introduced himself. The way people watched him when they thought he was not paying attention. Once you saw the truth, it became impossible to unsee. A week after our conversation in the cafe, Adrian invited me to lunch. I almost declined. Instead, I found myself sitting across from him in a quiet restaurant overlooking Central Park. The food was excellent. The view was beautiful. The tension between us was impossible to ignore. Adrian seemed to sense it immediately. "You have been avoiding me." I set down my glass. "You make it sound unreasonable." "Is it?" I stared out the window for a moment. Families walked through the park below. Dogs chased tennis balls. Everything looked simple from a distance. "I still do not know what to do with all of this," I admitted. Adrian nodded slowly. "Fair enough." "No, it is not fair enough." The words escaped before I could stop them. "Do you realize how strange this is? For weeks I thought I knew who you were." His expression remained calm. "You knew who I was." "I thought you were a taxi driver." "You thought I was a taxi driver." The distinction irritated me instantly. "That is exactly what I said." "No." His voice stayed gentle. "It is not." I folded my arms. "Then explain it." Adrian leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he simply studied me. Not defensively. Not angrily. Just patiently. "Did I ever tell you I was a taxi driver?" I opened my mouth, then stopped, because the answer was no. Not once. "Did I ever introduce myself that way?" Again no. "Did I ever lie to you about my name?" No. "About my background?" No. "About anything you directly asked?" The realization arrived slowly and annoyingly. Adrian watched it happen. "You assumed something because of what you saw," he said quietly. "And I did not correct it quickly enough. That part is my fault." I looked away. The frustrating thing was that he was right. I hated that he was right. "You still hid things." "Yes." The answer came immediately. "No excuses. No hesitación." Because some parts of my life are complicated. He glanced toward the park. And because I liked being around someone who saw me before all the other things. For a moment neither of us spoke. The city moved beyond the glass. Cars passed. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued. Then Adrian looked back at me. "Madison, when you sat in that taxi, you talked about books, terrible weather, and library fines." A small smile touched his face. "You treated me like a normal person." Something tightened in my chest. "And you wanted to keep that. More than I should have." His honesty left me without an argument. For the first time since discovering the truth, I began to understand something important. The biggest secret was not that Adrian had hidden his world from me. The biggest secret was how badly he seemed to want to escape it. 3 days later, my ordinary life stopped being ordinary. It began with a phone call from my aunt in Connecticut. We were not particularly close, but we spoke a few times each year. When I answered, her voice sounded unusually nervous. "Madison, has anyone been asking questions about your family?" I frowned and stepped away from the circulation desk. "What do you mean?" A brief silence followed. "2 men came by yesterday." My stomach tightened instantly. "What men?" "I do not know. They were polite," they said. "They were researching property records. They asked about your grandfather." Every instinct inside me told me something was wrong. My grandfather had passed away years earlier. Nobody had mentioned his name in a very long time. What exactly did they want? I asked. "Old documents. Family information." They seemed disappointed when I could not help them. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it left me unsettled for the rest of the day. That evening I called Adrian. He answered immediately. "What happened?" he asked before I said a word. Somehow that did not surprise me anymore. I told him everything. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "Madison, where are you right now?" His tone had changed. Calm but sharper than usual. "At home." "Stay there." "Adrian. Please." The single word stopped me. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up outside my apartment building. Adrian stepped out wearing a dark overcoat. Rain drifted through the city in fine silver lines. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he looked up at my apartment window. "There is something I need to show you." 40 minutes later we were sitting in a private conference room overlooking Manhattan. A thick folder rested on the table between us. Adrian opened it carefully. Inside were copies of property records, family photographs, and newspaper clippings dating back more than 20 years. I stared at them in confusion. What am I looking at? Adrian slid one document toward me. "Your grandfather owned land in upstate New York." "I know that. What you do not know is that several companies have spent the last 6 months trying to buy that property." I blinked. "Why?" Adrian exhaled slowly. "Because there may be something valuable connected to it." The room suddenly felt smaller. What kind of valuable? That is what everyone is trying to discover. My eyes moved across the papers. Old maps, survey records, legal filings. None of it made sense. Yet someone clearly believed those documents mattered. And now they are asking questions about my family. Adrian nodded. "Which means your family may know something without realizing it." I leaned back in my chair. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. Just weeks earlier my biggest concern had been overdue library books. Now I was sitting in a skyscraper discussing family secrets with one of the most powerful men in New York. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Adrian studied me carefully. "You are frightened." "I am confused." "That too." His expression softened slightly. "You are not dealing with this alone." The words settled over me with unexpected warmth. For the first time all evening my pulse slowed. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the rain. Inside, Adrian reached for another file. "There is one more thing." I looked up. "What?" His eyes met mine. "The first person who started investigating your family records 6 months ago used a fake name." He paused. "The second person did not." My stomach tightened. "Who was it?" Adrian slid a photograph across the table. The moment I saw it, my breath caught. Because I recognized the face immediately. It was someone I had trusted my entire life. For several seconds I could not breathe. I stared at the photograph lying on the conference table, willing it to become someone else. Anyone else. But the face remained the same. My Uncle Richard. My mother's older brother. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle. The man who never forgot my birthday. The man who had attended every major family event for as long as I could remember. "No, iwis parat." That cannot be right. Adrian did not argue. He simply watched me. I said the same thing when I first saw it. I picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. It had been taken recently. Richard looked older than I remembered, but there was no mistaking him. There has to be an explanation. There might be. Adrian's voice remained calm. "That is why I have not reached any conclusions." I looked through the rest of the documents. Property records. Meeting logs. Copies of business registrations. Richard's name appeared again and again. Not directly connected to anything illegal or suspicious. Just connected. Present. Involved. Interested. My head began to ache. He never mentioned any of this. Adrian nodded. Which means either he believed it was unimportant or he wanted it kept quiet. Neither possibility made me feel better. Outside the glass walls, rain continued drifting across Manhattan. The city lights reflected against the windows like scattered stars. For the first time in my life, I felt as though my family history contained entire chapters nobody had bothered to share with me. "What exactly is on that land?" I asked. Adrian folded his hands together. "Nobody knows for certain." "That is not possible." "It is surprisingly possible." He slid another document toward me. 30 years ago, a private development project was proposed for that region. Then it vanished. I studied the page. The project involved transportation routes, infrastructure plans, and land acquisitions. Everything had been abandoned before construction began. Why? The records disappeared. My eyes narrowed. Records do not just disappear. A faint smile touched his face. "You are learning quickly." Despite everything, I almost smiled back. Almost. Adrian opened another file. Inside were copies of old letters and handwritten notes. One signature immediately caught my attention. My grandfather's. I had not seen his handwriting in years. The sight alone tightened my chest. He kept records, Adrian said quietly. Very detailed records. I turned another page. Then another. Dates. Locations. Names. Observations. It looked less like a family archive and more like someone documenting a mystery. Suddenly a folded piece of paper slipped free and landed on the table. I unfolded it carefully. The note contained only a few lines. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. If anything happens to me, make sure Madison learns the truth when the time is right. My heart stopped. What truth? I whispered. Adrian looked at the note. Then at me. That is what we have been trying to discover. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. For the first time, I realized this investigation was no longer about old property or forgotten documents. It was about my family, my past, my future. And somewhere in the middle of all that uncertainty sat Adrian, the one person who seemed determined to help me find answers. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not fear, not anger, concern, real concern. He stood and looked directly at me. Madison, he said carefully. Someone just entered your apartment building and asked for you by name. For a moment the room seemed to freeze around me. The rain beyond the windows. The city lights. The stack of documents on the table. Everything faded behind a single thought. Someone was looking for me. Who is it? I asked immediately. Adrian glanced down at his phone again. We do not know yet. My pulse quickened. Then how do you know they asked for me? Because the concierge called one of my people. That answer should have raised questions. Instead, it somehow felt completely normal coming from Adrian. The man seemed connected to everything. He slipped his phone into his pocket and looked directly at me. Madison, I need you to trust me. The words were simple. Yet something about them felt heavier than anything he had said before. I studied him for a moment. The man who had appeared in a taxi on a rainy night. The man who carried more secrets than anyone I had ever known. The man who, despite all of that, had never stopped trying to protect me. I do, I said quietly. Something softened in his expression. Just for a second. Then it was gone. The next few hours passed quickly. Calls were made. Information was gathered. By midnight, the mystery finally unraveled. The person who had entered my apartment building was not a threat. It was my Uncle Richard. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. Then confusion replaced it. Why would he come looking for me without calling first? The answer arrived the following morning. Richard agreed to meet us in a small private office near the waterfront. The moment he walked into the room, I realized he looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like a man carrying a burden he could no longer manage alone. He sat down across from us and stared at the table for several seconds before speaking. I always knew this day would come. My heart tightened. Adrian remained silent. Richard looked at me. Your grandfather asked me to keep something safe. He reached into a worn leather briefcase and removed a small metal box. Time had scratched its surface. The lock looked decades old. Carefully, he placed it on the table. What is it? I asked. The reason everyone has been asking questions. Richard handed me a key. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked the box. Inside were letters, photographs, documents, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. For several moments I could not move. Then I opened it. The letter inside was short. My grandfather explained that the property everyone had been chasing was never the real secret. The land itself was ordinary. What mattered was hidden inside the records he spent years protecting. Evidence proving ownership of several charitable trusts that had quietly funded schools, libraries, and community programs across New York for decades. The funds had originally belonged to families who wanted their wealth used for public good. My grandfather had served as one of the trustees. After his death, responsibility was meant to pass to the next generation. To me, tears blurred my vision. Not because of the money, because of the trust. Because someone I loved had believed in me long before I understood why. Richard cleared his throat. I was trying to protect that responsibility until you were ready. Suddenly everything made sense. The questions, The records. The investigations. The secrecy. Across the table, Adrian watched quietly. No interruptions. No advice. Just steady support. Later that evening after Richard left, Adrian and I stood beside the Hudson River watching the sunset reflect across the water. For a long time neither of us spoke. Finally I looked at him. You know what is funny? He smiled slightly. Probably. I laughed. I spent weeks thinking you rescued me from a boring life. The wind moved gently across the river. City lights began appearing behind us. Adrian turned toward me, and I looked out at the skyline, at the city that suddenly felt different than it had before. Bigger, brighter, full of possibilities. Then I smiled. The truth is, Adrian, you did not change my life. Because of who you are. His expression softened. Then why? I thought back to the rainy night when everything began. Because you reminded me that sometimes the people worth trusting are the ones who show up when you least expect them. He laughed quietly. For the first time since I met him, he looked completely at peace. And standing there beside the river, I finally understood something. Everyone believed I was the passenger and Adrian was the driver. But somewhere along the way, we had both helped guide each other home.